I'm going to talk a bit about a few of the problems that I kind of have seen with organising around environmental issues in Ireland. And maybe instead of questions, it could be more of a comment than a question afterwards, because I would be really interested in getting everyone's thoughts and feedback, and I have no answers. So don't waste your time on questions. I do mean environmental collapse. Like, I know the title of the talk is Organising in the Face of Climate Crisis, but often I think we can get tunnel vision in terms of carbon emissions. And yes, they're extremely important, but oftentimes the destruction, the like wholesale destruction of nature and every other being we share the planet with can go ignored. And while often they are interconnected and they do exacerbate each other, oftentimes, like, you'll see a lot of these maybe kind of government proposals and stuff for reducing carbon emissions have negative effects on biodiversity, and I don't think we can really afford to let that happen, you know, because we're just exacerbating one crisis. And so the urgency and immediacy of other issues, you know, war, COVID, cost of living, energy crisis, record-breaking natural disasters that are unfortunately only going to get worse and worse, often mean that environmental action is relegated to this, like, when we have time. Oh, you know, it's not the time to talk about that now. And like Bernadette was saying on Friday about how the capitalists already have plans or are already planning for United Ireland Inc. They're similarly planning and preparing for all manner of shocks and environmental crises, and it is seen as opportunity. Like, one really stark example was, you know, when the war in Ukraine started, there was all this talk about food security in Europe, and so quickly there were large lobby groups ready with policies on stripping environmental regulations in the name of food security. And it was head-spinning how quick it all happened. You know, there were farming regulations that were postponed for food security, and it happened before even a broader conversation around, well, what type of food production should we prioritize in cases of insecurity could even really get off the ground. And of course, these crises will never stop. There'll never be a moment where excuse me, where like a bedraggled government will turn to us and kindly be like, well, we're ready to deal with the environmental crisis now. Instead, I think, you know, we need to be ready with solutions and responses, and as Sean was saying yesterday, with policies, because the capitalists are ready with policies. And, you know, while these will need to respond to the actual effects of whatever crisis we're talking about, they also need to be created through a lens of environmental impact. And is this just going to push a problem downstream? Sometimes literally when you're talking about flooding, is this just going to exacerbate the underlying causes of this catastrophe, whatever it is? And I'm not saying, of course, that if you're, you know, predominantly involved in housing activism or, you know, working conditions or health, that you have to now start reading about methane and floodplains and all of that. What I'm saying is, or what I'm trying to say, is that, you know, environmental breakdown and the opposite of that are not, and climate change, are not like discrete silos. They're not discrete departments in our life. There's no like company that's sole job is to, you know, engage in these damaging things. They are caused by all the systems that impact every single part of our lives. And so the solutions can really only be realized through things like housing, health, transport, energy. Like, there's very few policies that are just climate change policies that aren't predominantly a policy in another department first. So no matter what activism you're involved in, instead of imagining it like you have to, you know, pick up another topic, you're already carrying it, really. It's already embedded in whatever you work in, and it's just kind of remembering that and recognizing that every piece of activism around everything has an environmental impact, whether good or bad. And so it's not extra work, it's just kind of rearranging your work a tiny bit. And so I live and work in a very rural place, and full disclosure, like we grew up with sheep on hills, a hill farm you call it. It's a very rural area, a lot of tourism, odd dynamics, really high land prices because of the tourism, but poor agricultural land. And there is very strong organising around agriculture in rural areas, and a not insignificant amount of it is quite reactionary. And increasingly I'm seeing I feel it's imported. I don't know, is Mark here? I think Mark would have a much clearer idea of the kind of the pathways of these things. But a lot of this anti-environmentalism is, at least it's being perpetuated through the language of the far right. Like there's a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't engage with that sort of thing, talking about global leak conspiracies and all of this sort of thing. And you do still hear, although it's lessening, you do still hear outright climate change denial. And I think a lot of that is fear of loss of power rather than any specific environmental regulation that may, or more likely in Ireland, may not happen. Because, you know, for decades we've had certain industries in control of what happens to land and the seas and the rivers and who benefits from it. And I think as this conversation is shifting publicly, people saying, well, maybe we don't just want a colonial form of agriculture, the leftovers of how the British Empire treated Ireland's land. Maybe it could be more of a public good. There is, what I believe we're seeing is a defensiveness over the loss of that say, over, like, we decide what happens to land. Because, it might not seem it, but you have more access to green space and more access to nature in cities than you do in rural areas unless you own land. Like if you're going for a walk in a rural area, now with the odd exception of places where you can get up mountains, but you're just on this like tiny road with like trucks barreling by you, and there's nowhere to relax or just to be in public areas. And I think conversations around land in Ireland do have to be opened up. I was reading last night and about the land war, and someone said, and that's how the question, the Irish land question was settled. And I was like, well, I don't know, is it settled? No longer settled. And we also need to look at how we're using land and what effect that has around the world. Like food security is so much more complicated than how many calories do we export that equals adding to food security. Like food security can be different in a household scale. And we owe other countries looking at how our agriculture affects them and how our, reliance on importation of food affects them. And I don't think we should shy away from addressing those power dynamics in rural areas, those dynamics over who owns the land and who gets a say in what happens to it. Alongside the outright climate change denial, there are these invisible signals I think we are all subject to. You probably all saw them before I did. It genuinely took COVID for me to realize that there had been invisible signals the whole time of you'll be fine, this will be fine. Oh, I'll be really, really quick. And they do come from all around us. Like you can see with COVID, people took it seriously because it was treated seriously. And I think I have found it really difficult to convince people that this is extremely serious. And while some people actually might be fine here in Ireland, already today, every day, people are dying of environmental collapse, and it's not fine, actually. And then I'll just make one last point about animals and the incredible suffering globally that animals endure just to be turned into food or fibre for the capitalist system. Like they deserve so much more than the torturous lives that are kind of imposed upon them. And I feel like I'm not here saying everyone has to go vegan. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is if we allow capitalism to treat some beings so terribly. I think, like, if we're to give capitalism good kicking, or whatever it was Stevie said at the beginning of this weekend, we can't afford to turn a blind eye to certain areas of capitalist violence. And I feel that we run the risk of letting it survive in its most vicious forms. We run the risk of it just never dying like some awful zombie. And then one last question I would have, and it runs over and over in my head, and I'd be interested if anyone had any thoughts on it, is like, if we were promised today that the government would never do enough, no matter who we elected, no matter what we did, they would not do enough, what would we do? How would we organize? I'm not saying we should necessarily act like that, but it's a question I can't answer, and I'd be really interested to hear from everyone else. So anyway, thank you for allowing me to give us a sweaty note talk, and I look forward to hearing everyone else. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks, Saoirse. Now I'm going to completely take another angle from that. When we talk about organising in a climate chaos, we often talk about in organising circles how to organise the unorganised. And I guess from my background, I'm going to kind of touch on maybe how we organise young people and students' unions particularly. I see a few whoops in the back from people who are obviously involved in it. I often joke and say that I was radicalised in the student movement. People in the student movement don't like when I say that, because it was actually more out of frustration of the untapped potential that was going on there. Like, you can argue that, yes, students are in the union. Are they not organised? I would argue that they're not organised in a way that we want to be talking about today. I know VJ said yesterday, that students are being labelled terrorists in certain places. I don't know if you could say that about the Irish student movement at the moment. It's not quite there. There's a lot of indifference amongst students who are actually members. They maybe don't see themselves as member of a union, or see themselves getting organised in the union, and maybe potentially don't know what the possibilities of what unions are. After all, we're not really told about trade union power in school or colleges, and that's not really talked about. And many of us younger members were born after the Industrial Relations 1990 Act, where trade union power was shown in a very different way. I remember when we were kind of planning for a student training event where we train up all the student leaders across the country, and I suggested that we run a non-violent direct action training, and the shock. What? Why would we be doing that? Jesus, we'd never done that before. And suggesting political education as part of what student leaders should be learning. That was the first time I think someone might have been suggesting that. And it was kind of taken down as quite surprise, but I didn't think there was anything wrong about training students up on how to sit in president's offices to get what we want. But apparently it was a bit of a surprise. We're a bit further away from the violent clashes that some people would have seen with police and student protests from years before. But often, some of these suggestions, or maybe more radical activists in the movement or outside the elected roles, might not be seen as welcome, and I think that's something that needs to be talked about too. They're the people that we need inside the movement, educating, agitating, organising, putting themselves forward for roles, or at least being a big part of the conversation, because at the moment, those kind of student activists don't see themselves in those unions. They don't see that their energy should be put in those structures, and are often organising from the outside or on the side, often facing up against the elected members of the union. So I do think there's kind of a conversation to be had there. And there is a problem as well, because colleges are so underfunded at the moment, the services are underfunded, students' unions are left plugging the gaps. They're running accommodation lists, they're doing printing and binding, but where's the organising happening? They're turning into service providers as opposed to organising and building power a lot of the time. And I know Paul made a comment in his session yesterday around business trade unions, and I wonder, could a comparison be drawn? You say often focused on insurance instead of class struggle, and you could probably say the same amongst students' unions as well, and I think that needs to be looked at. Students shouldn't be just running services. We should be building power. We should be politically educating our members to know why they need to organise and why we're building power, and really understand that. And I know Bernadette on Friday said, to campaign is to propagandise, but organising is a different thing. And I know like student officers are told how to do campaign strategy and how to run what are essentially kind of PR information campaigns about, services and stuff. And we're actually not taught about organising. We're not taught about how to map our networks, how to identify the leaders, and how to build power in that way, and how to organise. So I think like representation is very important, on committee levels and stuff in colleges. But actually, a lot of it is wrapped in bureaucracy, and it really drains the energy from a lot of student leaders. We talk about partnership and student partnership on campuses, and that's important. We're co-creating courses, and it's a step in the right direction. And I have been told that there is Marxist backgrounds to that concept about keeping the marketization out of campuses and stuff. But you have to wonder: is there similarities there around social partnership? And a lot of people would argue that social partnership did damage to how trade union members build power or how they view that. Do students know how to organise outside of the boardroom after they step off that committee where they're co-creating courses? And I think that's a question that we really need to think about. There obviously are very good examples of organising on campuses, example in Queen's where they were divesting from fossil fuels. But for the most part, what we're doing is mostly mobilising. We're mobilising for a protest outside the Dáil. A lot of the time there's a political education to back that up, and we're not talking about deep organising skills. I guess, where would we learn that? You go to school and, there's modules on business, and I remember seeing a question that was put online, I think it was in the junior cert or the leaving cert, and it was what are the pros and cons of the trade union movement? And I was like, cons for who exactly? What are we talking about there? But yeah, and then we talk about neoliberal universities, and we can go on about that for a very long time, but you have industry who are dictating what kind of courses are being run, and we're definitely not talking about, talking about enough coming up with how do we organise against climate chaos or any of that. And that's before you even talk about the conditions for workers and PhD students on those campuses. So I really think there's a space there that's quite untapped for that, political and climate groups exist on these campuses, but they don't have the full resources of space, funding, access to members that the students' unions would. And I think there's something there for those kind of clubs and societies to maybe have a think about and how they could use the structures that are there to organise more and empower. But I guess what my question is for everyone here today, who is supporting those officers to become organisers? Who's supporting the students to become organisers? It's not the staff in the unions, and it's not the staff in the students' unions or on campus. It's not the officers who were before them who were also used to just mobilising instead of organising, we really need to think about the crossover between trade unions and students' unions. And, students' unions have a huge turnover. You've students who do courses for 4 years and then they're gone. You have officers who are elected for a year and then they're gone. So it's going to take work, it's going to take continuous work. And I know we talk about how organising is work, and it's a lot of effort. But I want you all to have a think about it today. What kind of organised networks are you in? Is there young members involved in them? How can you reach out to students' unions, young members, committees, anything like that? Because I feel like it shouldn't be just young members fighting for youth issues or students fighting for student issues, and it's much more than that. And we also have to consider as well, are trade unions talking about how we organise? Are they training up their members to know how to use their power? For example, I'm a young member of a union. Not that young, I am 30, but I'm still classed as a young member in a union. In my years as a trade union member, I have not been offered any training on how to organise in my workplace. I had to seek that externally outside of my union, which is unfortunate. I guess I'm in a luckier position that we have an active youth committee that works and everything. We actually have voting rights on our executive. Can't say the same for a lot of other unions who might not have organised youth committees, but also mightn't even have a seat on their executive committee or even have voting rights. So it's really kind of we're not bringing people along with us, So if we're talking about, organising for our future and young people's future, we're already here. It's a present, and we're already workers, and we want to be involved in the same way. And often we do have a bit of second-class membership in some ways, but actually we face some of the most precarious, low-paid work, and we should be at the table with the same kind of access, and that is a problem. Young there's there's kind of seats on different committees for young members or whatever, and you know, it's the same people filling those seats because there isn't enough young members, and like it can feel kind of tokenistic as well. Like, sure, you meet the requirements for this, so you can sit on all of these committees, but really we're not addressing the root cause of the problem. We haven't done the work to organise young members enough so that they can actually engage in the structures and build power in the union. So I think that that's a problem. Like, you know, yes, we have our youth committees, and at the moment it's important that we're at those committees, that we can suggest, you know, to create organising plans, to do phone banking, to do organising. But, you know, committees aren't the be-all and end-all either. But I guess, like something that Sarah Jaff said yesterday, like, do we have a plan? Do we have a climate plan? Do we have an organising climate plan? Is that coming up in those committees even? But it's our role to be like bringing that up and seeing what the solutions are there as well. And there are examples of young people getting organised. For example, the Community Action Tenants Union. They're literally out door knocking, they're doing the one-to-one conversations, they're training up their members on how to organise, how to have those conversations, how to door knock, how to phone bank, but we're just not seeing that same kind of, you know, doing the direct action. All of that is happening in that Community Action Tenants Union. That's where we're learning our skills, and we're kind of suggesting, well, why isn't that happening in our trade unions or our student unions? So we do have examples there of good practice, and I think we should look at them and work with them to kind of develop that. Because like we do, like I know we don't have a climate union, we have a housing union now, we don't have a climate union. Not saying that we need it, but we need to make sure that when we're organising for climate chaos that we're talking about it in there. And I know Paul said actually in a talk yesterday as well, like that climate NGOs can be a Trojan horse for neoliberalism. So, you know, we're not going there for the answers either. So where are we going for the answers? And I kind of want to pose that question to you today, like, you know, what are you going to do about this, about these issues that we've addressed here? How are you going to support the development of organisational skills amongst young members so that we can build power and organise against climate chaos?
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to be very brief, actually. Not feeling great. Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm glad Michelle used the phrase agitate, educate, and organise, because one of my frustrations in this country is the failure to even try and comprehend what that means. We do a lot of the agitate element of it, on the left in particular, and like being a coordinator of the Right to Water campaign, people look back at that, and even in the heart of it when it was going on, I could spot that this is not an organising campaign whatsoever. This is just a mobilisation. No disrespect to it, obviously. It was a brilliant campaign and a huge amount of activists across the country, and it was really powerful to watch. But there were no structures that were built, and that was deliberate. Now, it was a product of its time. It was very difficult. There was a lot of mistrust in the trade union movement in particular, from working class communities, and we tried to rebuild some of that trust in there. But while it was a success to some extent, the biggest failure is that, you know, there's no remnants of it really left from a structural perspective that we could just tap into immediately and go again. Because it's a permanent struggle on water, as it is on climate, as it is on everything else. They're going to come back for it because it's so profitable. Like, water is the most profitable non-financial asset on the planet. So of course they're going to come back to try and privatise it in the future. And I remember during the Right to Water campaign having conversations with some of the other coordinators around this and saying we need to get a structure around this. And even within the trade unions, there was a real resistance to bringing in structures to something that was that big and that powerful and what it was doing. And I think Left Bloc, to be perfectly honest, came from myself and Stevie having a conversation around how can we bring about structures to some of this stuff for the future, to make sure this stuff doesn't slip away again. I'm not a member of a political party. I'm a member of a trade union, activist with the trade union movement for over 20 years. I don't want to, no disrespect to all the political parties in the room, I don't want to join a political party, but I want to be politically active. I think there's other people in the room that would feel the same. So how do I do that? We need a vehicle for that, because the trade unions are very difficult to be active in. It's a struggle to get active in a trade union. It really is, like, because there's people, as Michelle said, people who've been there a long time, and they don't, like, in a lot of places, workplaces that I experience, there's no elections for people. Like, I was elected as a shop steward in 2002 or 3 in An Post, in the postal sector. Like, it's the complete opposite of my argument here, but like, nobody else wanted to run. That's why I was elected. Like, but they, at least in there, in the CW, Communications Workers Union at the time, there was an annual election. I don't see that happening in trade unions now. In a lot of them now, you know, I come from a specific union and a specific background, so other people may be doing that, and maybe that's a question for later on. But I remember as well, just in terms of the so agitate. That's the agitation bit. I'm pissed off because we're really good at agitation a lot of the time, but we don't pay attention to the other two half as much. So the next part is education, and if you look at it, like, I'm going to talk from an Irish perspective, but Paul does his work as well. But Trademark are really the only organisation that are doing this political economy education throughout the country. There's individuals that are doing stuff like Conor McCabe and others that are doing great work as individuals. But even within that, like, Trademark training courses, our members absolutely love them. And I remember getting my first one as well, and I loved it. It's brilliant. Like, it's like this on steroids. This weekend on steroids, like 3-day political economy training, and the members absolutely lap it up. But it's funny how a lot of trade unionists who are in control of education don't engage them. Like, I didn't speak to Stevie about this before, but I don't think there's any union right now that's using Trademark for their political education. That's a shambles, because it's badly needed. And Saoirse mentioned about policies, like, and what are we doing around, well, first of all, we haven't got any policies, and even if we did, we have no structures and no organisation to sort of have those policies implemented. And I was talking to a number of people from different political parties last night and having this chat about how, it's funny, we've got members of political parties like Sinn Féin, People Before Profit, CYM, CPI, ICP, we've got Unearthed Glass, we've got, from unions, we've got Forset, Man, we've a whole range of people here who all agree on this, that we can't fuck about with this anymore. This is really fucking serious. But we're not talking to each other and building our own networks among that group. And that's the intention, my intention, not Stevie. Stevie disagrees with me fundamentally on this. But I wanted Left Bloc to be that sort of network, like have a Left Bloc in Sinn Féin, a Left Bloc in Mandate, in Forza, in the different unions, that are talking to each other and saying, do you know what, as multiple parties, multiple trade union people here, but we all agree, there's people in, I'll just use one party, like say Sinn Féin, there's people in here who have more in common with other people in this room who are in other political parties or in other trade unions than they do with a lot of people in their own parties. And we've been sucked into tribalism around some of this stuff, and I think it's too important an issue for any more tribalism. I think we really need to get organised ourselves. So when I was talking to Michelle about this last week, about what I was going to speak about, I was going to speak about not organising the unorganised, but how do we organise the already organised? I'm not saying they are actually organised, but they've got structures. So how do we impact on those structures? How do we, in Mandate Trade Union, I'm a member of Unite as well, how do we force our unions to campaign on this issue and to really invest in it and take it seriously and push it? Because right now, what I'm seeing from the trade union movement is a couple of press releases going out about climate change and no real organising. Like if Trademark are not doing political economy in trade unions, and we're not talking about capitalism and how it's destroying the planet, then we're not really dealing with the key issue at hand. So my question to people here is, Vijay, we were in the car on the way down, and even conversation since with multiple other people, and Bernadette said it to me as well. What the fuck is Left Bloc? Like, and it wasn't her question, interestingly. Somebody she asked to come down said, I would like to know the political parameters around what Left Bloc is before I engage in such a project. So Bernadette rang me to ask, what the fuck is Left Bloc? I have to come back and tell this fellow what it is. Are you all tankies? And I said, no, we're not. There's people in there from the Green Party. There's people in there from, the Communist Party. There's people from all backgrounds running the podcast and engaging in it. But even that, like, that shows you how difficult it is. If people won't engage until they find out what the political fucking parameters of ourselves are. Like, so my question to people in the audience is similar to the ones asked earlier: is what left? Like, again, VJ yesterday, experimental. We need to experiment. This left block stuff is an experiment, and as something that doesn't really have any structures or anything, it can be shaped. So I wanted to ask people in the audience and people, here, even other speakers, what do you think we can make of such an organisation? Do we leave it loose? Do we formalise it? Do we try and build something around it? Or do we just leave it as a political education project with a couple of podcasts and a few articles that go up on the website? Or what do we do? But I just wanted to throw that out to people and ask people, even, I'm not looking for an answer right now off everyone, right? But go home, have a think about it. Is there something that we can build around some of this stuff that we can cooperate together on? Because I think the time for fucking about and messing about is gone.
So that was really great to hear from Saoirse, Michelle and Dave, and I want to thank the organisers again for putting on the event and for inviting me over. So the parameters for this particular session were quite loose, so we're just told to talk about organising, and the sessions I've been at here and the sessions that I was involved in as well, an awful lot of what we've done is pose the problem and posed it in the genuine stark terms in which it confronts us. And I think both Saoirse and Michelle were right. We need to be very explicit with the language we use these days. Climate change is a thing of the past. Climate breakdown is the present. Climate breakdown is very real. Climate breakdown is hitting all of us to some degree or another. Some people far more severely than others. But this is where we are. We're in a fight for our lives. And then when we talk about organising and how to be confronted, right, it can be terrifying. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if any of you have ever read The Grapes of Wrath, and there's a scene in the film, but there's an exchange in the film where there's a character called Muley, who's a subsistence farmer, and a fella comes along with a bulldozer and says, "Look, the bank have sent me around. You haven't made any payments. I have to knock down your farm." And he says, "Look, I built that with my own bare hands, and if you try and knock that down, I'm going to shoot you." And your man says, "Well, don't shoot me. I just got sent out here by the bank. I'm just doing my job." But he says, "Right, well, I'm going to go in and shoot the bank manager." He says, "Well, don't shoot him." He said, "He's just doing what the shareholders back in New York have told him to do." And he said, "Well, who can I shoot?" Right? And for working class people, for the people at the coalface of climate breakdown, who can I shoot is the very real question they're asking. And at the minute, the left, globally speaking, is failing. And this is part of the reason why the right is in the ascendant, because they're offering people the easy answers as to who they can shoot and who they should shoot and who's to blame. And it's all bullshit. It's all snake oil, but they're offering the easy answers. So when we talk about organisation, the obligation is on us to come up with concrete ways in the here and now, because the time scale is against us. The clock is ticking. Again, this isn't something we can wait for and try and address in 5 years, 10 years. This is something we should have been addressing 20 years ago. There's that old expression, the best time to plant a tree is 50 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is now, right? And so we are starting from a position of immense weakness. We have to be explicit about that. This is Gramsci's old idea, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Pessimism doesn't mean giving up and going, "Oh crap, I'm fucked. I'm going to see if I can move off to the Aran Islands and live there on my own. And nobody will bother me until the sea gets too high," right? Pessimism of the intellect means being brutally honest about where we are. And this comes back to some of what's been mentioned by Michelle, by Dave, and by Saoirse. We can change the world around us, right? We have the capacity. And when I say we, I mean quite explicitly the international working class, the only ones who can confront climate breakdown in any meaningful way, right? We can change it, and we have to act to change it. But again, going back to the old mole, we don't do it under conditions of our own choosing. We have inherited practices within our trade unions, within political organisations, within community groups that have inbuilt limitations in it. Because capitalism as a system, the way it operates, and this is where Thatcher was so immensely successful. When Thatcher came out and said there is no alternative, people internalised that. Not just the people in her party, but many people on the left And that's what a lot of the left has become for the last 30 years. It's just sort of scrabbling around the edges, going, right, well, the ship's going down, where can we get air seat on it so we get to see the sunset at least before we all go under, right? That's where we're at. Instead of saying, right, how do we transform this in a very fundamental way? And in order to do that, we're going to have very serious and sometimes very, very, very confrontational conversations with people about what politics means, about what organising means. And we're going to have to start from a position of the political education aspect of it. For ourselves, in the first instance, those of us who are already in motion, those of us who are already active, but then to bring that to our communities, to our workplaces, to our local pubs, to our local GAA clubs, and have these conversations with people in a way that makes it tangible and real to them. So if you wanted to boil it all down, Marx's whole theory of class struggle and class conflict, just tell your friends, you know what I mean, when they're scrambling around to try and pay their electricity bills, that there's billionaires having a fucking laugh, racing each other into space. You know what I mean? This is where we are. It's not the migrants coming over here, you know what I mean? It's not the sort of faceless bureaucrats in the European Union, even though the European Union is fundamentally flawed. It's the class antagonisms at the heart of the system. So who can you shoot? Look up. Look for the spaceships. Look for the people that are flying out there. That's where you should aim your fire, right? But we have to do the serious work around that. You've probably all heard of Mary Jones, Mother Jones, from Cork. Wasn't she Cork originally? Once described as the most dangerous woman in America. She was apparently speaking at a union rally once, and someone ran in and said, the police have come, they're here to break it. And while everybody else was looking around and saying, what's happening, she hopped off the stage and pulled the pocket knife out and went running out to try and confront the police out in the street, right? So she was a woman of action. She was an organizer. She was an agitator par excellence. But when she was involved in a strike with miners in Appalachia, she said to them in the heart of the strike, sit down and read, prepare yourself for the fights that are coming, right? And we did that in Manchester recently. There's a wave of strike action across Britain for very good reasons. Part of our response to that was to go out and support the strikes, go on the picket lines and contribute and raise money for the strike funds. But we also put together a reading group. There's a recent book out called Class Struggle Unionism by a guy called Joe Byrne. Going back to what Michelle was saying. And Joe has a very useful typology of how we think about trade unions, right? And the dominant model of all trade unions right across the world is this business model of trade unionism, right? And that again goes back to Thatcher's thing about there being no alternative, because the business model is just there to get the best possible deal for workers in a system that invariably gives workers the worst possible deal, right? And so that trade unions are there scrubbing around the edges. There's a reason why they don't have trademark doing their political education over here, because they don't want to talk about it. I mean, when again, you're mainly just concerned about how do you get a fair wage for someone in a system built on the exploitation of their labour. You don't. You can get them a slightly better wage in the circumstances, but unless you're ready to address the root causes of the inequalities, the root causes of the injustice, the root causes of the power imbalances, well, then you're never going to actually deal with the serious issues. And so in Ireland and everywhere else, we have to have these conversations about what do we want our unions to look like, right? You can keep doing the business model of trade unionism, and we can't just wish it away. You know, there's sometimes that tendency to go, let's set up a new union, and let's set up a new political party. Right, Grant, all six of you, and you can be, you know, content with yourself in the purity of politics. Yeah, there was two of them. There was two unions, three in each. So we can't run away from the institutions that we've inherited, but we have to understand that they are exactly that. Marx has this old line that the sort of experiences of the dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the living, right? So the institutions we've inherited are the institutions that were sort of formalized and were entrenched in a period of defeat. When Thatcher broke the miners, when Reagan broke the air traffic controllers, when Pinochet butchered trade unionists and socialists, when the French government broke the public sector workers, the trade union movement, the socialist movement, the international communist movement lost in world historic terms, and we still haven't fully recovered from it. But part of the problem is, when we're confronted with this period of breakdown, this period of real crisis, we reach for the old clothes. We reach for the things that we know. We're cosplaying about where would you have stood on the sort of Kronstadt, and what was your position on, Bernadette mentioned it yesterday, what was your position on the Soviet Union, degenerate worker state or state, right? These are interesting questions in their own right, but how do they advance our struggle for anti-imperialist eco-socialism in the 21st century? Not very much, I'd say. And if I was given So if someone asked me concretely, where should we start thinking and looking, I'd always say to people, Martha Harnecker, who was a Chilean Marxist and socialist. She was also intimately involved in both Bolivia and Venezuela and helping to develop the new forms of mass working class and indigenous politics that they developed in that part of the world. And this is where we need to be now. We need to be having the serious conversations about how do we get to the point of building a mass movement which is organically connected to the working class in its different forms, especially in Ireland. The Irish left has always been absolutely abysmal on rural issues, on sort of rural poverty, sort of the particular conditions that rural workers face and so forth, and it still hasn't addressed it in any way, shape or form. So we have to develop a politics that is adequate to the crisis confronted by the working class in Ireland today, and then over across the water, we'll have to develop one adequate to the crisis faced by the working class in Britain, and then we have to link it all up. Because unless it's internationalist, unless it's anti-imperialist, again, we're not going to solve any of these problems. I mentioned in the sessions that I had yesterday a guy called Thomas Sankara, who was a fantastic anti-imperialist and an international. So of course the British and the CIA conspired to have him assassinated. But before he did that, he gave a speech about imperialism and climate breakdown. And he ended the speech by saying, "The desert doesn't recognize any borders. This system is coming for us all, right? And so we have to get organized collectively on an international level to confront it." So then that brings us back to an important point about organisation. How am I for time, Eve? Grand, I only need one. That'd be grand.
Just made that up.
Then there's a crucial point about organising. Different people have mentioned organising models, and it is important. It's important that we think seriously about how we organise. But organising models are no substitute for the political analysis, right? So you can't go off and sort of do the Jane McAlevey stuff, which is very useful, and go, okay, I know how to do power structure analysis, and that's great, right? But Jane McAlevey leaves out entirely from her whole analysis the elephant in the room, which was a mass communist party in the United States that was central to winning all of the victories that the working class movement won in the United States. A fairly sizable communist party in Britain, which also played that central role. And this brings us back to, well, what's organising for, right? The education part of it is important. The agitation part of it is quite easy because people are angry. They are asking who can they shoot, right? The people are scared, they're frustrated, they're right on the edge and ready to do something. The danger is unless we offer them the progressive focus, they can quite easily do something that's more reactionary and right-wing. But when we're organising, we're not organising just to do the education, we're organising for power. We're organising for working class power, independent of, and it will have to be independent of, although it might relate to existing political parties and existing unions. Frederick Douglass, who you've probably all heard of, he was an emancipated slave. He freed himself, taught himself how to read and so forth. He has the key line that should inform all of us when we're trying to think about what we do. I think it was Saoirse, but others have mentioned, like, well, no government's going to do X, Y, and Z. But of course they're not, right? And this is the thing. Frederick Douglass hit the nail on the head. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So when we're organising, we have to think in fucking street fighting terms. We have to think, right, how do we put together a body of people, right? A mass organisation of people who understand who they should be shooting at and who are powerful enough and organised enough to make those people fearful enough that they will then concede the demands we make. And once we make the initial demands, then we want more. Once we get the first loaf out of the oven, we're coming back for the whole bakery, right? Because we understand that we're the people, the working class on an international level, we're the people that produce everything. Nothing happens without us. And we're the people, the only people, who stand any chance of mitigating and then hopefully rolling back the climate breakdown that this capitalist system has brought upon us. So I'll leave it there.